March 22, 1944.
Camp Concordia, Kansas.
The metallic clang of serving spoons against steel trays echoed through the vast dining hall as Feldwebel Ernst Richter stood frozen in the doorway, his skeletal frame casting a shadow barely visible in the afternoon light. Through the haze of steam rising from industrial kitchens, he watched something that violated every principle of warfare he had been taught. American guards sat elbow to elbow with German prisoners, sharing tables, passing salt shakers, laughing at jokes that transcended the barrier of language and enmity. The scene before him seemed pulled from a fever dream, an impossibility that challenged the very foundation of military hierarchy and the natural order of captor and captive that every soldier understood as immutable law. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ernst had spent 18 months in the North African campaign, watching his unit shrink from 200 men to barely 40 survivors. He had seen friends die not from British bullets but from dysentery brought on by contaminated water and starvation rations. He had learned to sleep through artillery barrages but would wake instantly at the sound of a can opener, hoping for a distribution of the watery soup that passed for sustenance in Rommel's increasingly desperate army. The metal taste of hunger had become so familiar that he sometimes forgot what real food tasted like, his memories of his mother's kitchen in Dresden fading like photographs left too long in sunlight. The surrender had come in Tunisia during the spring of 1943 when General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim raised the white flag over what remained of the Afrika Korps. Ernst remembered standing in formation with thousands of other hollow-eyed soldiers, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that had lost 30 or 40 pounds to the desert's merciless appetite. The British had processed them first, offering tea and biscuits that many men couldn't keep down, their stomachs having forgotten how to process anything beyond the black bread and occasional potato that had sustained them through the final desperate months. What followed was a journey that seemed designed to break whatever remained of their spirit. Packed into the holds of transport ships, the prisoners crossed the Mediterranean to Casablanca, then waited in overcrowded transit camps where disease spread through the ranks like wildfire. Ernst had watched men who survived years of combat succumb to pneumonia and tuberculosis within weeks of capture. The waiting was its own form of torture, knowing that somewhere across an ocean lay a land of plenty while they subsisted on rations that would have been considered criminal negligence in peacetime. The Atlantic crossing took 17 days aboard a converted freighter called the SS Hampton Roads. Ernst and 300 other prisoners were crammed into a cargo hold that had recently carried military equipment to the European theater. The smell of diesel fuel and rust mixed with unwashed bodies created an atmosphere so thick it felt solid. Men vomited constantly from seasickness, unable to keep down the thin gruel and hard biscuits that constituted their daily ration. At night, Ernst would lie awake listening to men cry out in their sleep, calling for mothers and wives they might never see again. Yet even in that misery, there were signs of something different about their Americans. The guards who supervised the prisoners weren't the brutal enforcers that Nazi propaganda had promised. They were farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, most of them barely 20 years old and clearly uncomfortable with their role as jailers. One guard named Jimmy would sometimes share his cigarettes with prisoners, accepting nothing in return except perhaps a moment of shared humanity in circumstances that denied it. During the crossing, Ernst witnessed something that stayed with him throughout the journey. An American sailor no older than 19 was distributing meals to the prisoners when he stumbled, sending an entire sheet of food cascading across the deck. Ernst watched as the young man's face crumpled, not in anger at the clumsiness but in what appeared to be genuine distress at the waste. Within minutes, kitchen staff appeared with replacement meals, serving the prisoners without comment or delay. The casual replacement of what would have been a week's rations in the Afrika Korps revealed resources that seemed almost magical in their abundance. They made landfall at Hampton Roads, Virginia, where the processing began in earnest. Medical examinations revealed the extent of malnutrition that had become normalized in the German military. Ernst stood in line with other prisoners, watching as American doctors shook their heads at the visible ribs, the swollen joints indicating vitamin deficiencies, the pallor that spoke of anemia and worse. One doctor, an older man with kind eyes, examined Ernst's mouth and immediately called for supplements. The scurvy was advanced, he explained through an interpreter, but treatable with proper nutrition. The processing station provided their first and Ernst approached it with suspicion born of experience. Surely this was propaganda, a show put on for new arrivals that would disappear once they reached permanent camps. The tray they handed him contained more food than he had seen in a single sitting since before the war. White bread, actual white bread made from wheat flour rather than sawdust and potato starch. A thick soup with visible chunks of meat and vegetables. Coffee that smelled like the real thing, accompanied by small paper packets of sugar and a tiny container of cream. Ernst sat at a long wooden table with other newly arrived prisoners, none of them speaking as they stared at their trays. Franz Weber, a panzer driver from Hamburg who had been captured alongside Ernst, was the first to break the silence. "This is a trick," he whispered. "They want us fat before they work us to death." But hunger won over caution, and soon they were eating with the desperate focus of men who had known starvation. The bread had texture and flavor that Ernst had forgotten existed. The soup contained actual beef, not the mystery meat of canned rations, but recognizable chunks that fell apart under gentle pressure from his spoon. The coffee proved almost overwhelming. Real coffee beans, ground and brewed to a strength that bordered on luxury. Ernst added sugar, watching the crystals dissolve with fascination. In Germany, sugar had been rationed since 1939, with families receiving perhaps 200 grams per month if they were fortunate. Here he could add as much as he wanted, the small packets seemingly endless in their availability. The cream transformed the bitter brew into something approaching decadence, a taste he associated with peacetime cafes and Sunday mornings before the world caught fire. Within an hour of finishing the meal, Ernst was violently ill. His stomach, conditioned to accept near-starvation rations, rebelled against the sudden influx of rich food.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He wasn't alone. Half the prisoners from his transport spent their first night in America hunched over toilets, their bodies purging what should have been nourishment. The camp doctor, a man named Captain Morrison, explained through interpreters that this was normal, that their digestive systems needed time to adjust. He prescribed a gradual increase in portions and richness, monitoring each prisoner's tolerance like a chef perfecting a recipe. The train journey to Kansas took 4 days, and Ernst spent it pressed against windows that framed a country he had been taught to despise and fear. The propaganda had painted America as a nation of gangsters and racial chaos, of breadlines and desperate poverty masked by Hollywood fantasy. What Ernst saw challenged every element of that narrative. Small towns passed by with grocery stores displaying full windows. He saw restaurants with painted signs advertising daily specials, their parking areas filled with automobiles that suggested widespread prosperity rather than elite privilege. The agricultural abundance proved most disturbing to his worldview. Endless fields of wheat stretched to horizons unmarked by shell craters or military fortifications. Dairy farms featured herds of cattle so numerous Ernst lost count. Orchards heavy with fruit lined the railway, and in one memorable stretch through Missouri, he watched workers harvesting crops while eating lunches that appeared substantial even from a distance. These were not the desperate peasants that Nazi ideology insisted must exist in capitalist democracies. These were well-fed workers operating machinery that spoke of technological advancement rather than primitive exploitation. At one stop in St. Louis, the train halted near a schoolyard where children were playing during recess. Ernst watched them with an ache that went beyond hunger. They ran and laughed with an energy that came from never knowing deprivation. Their clothes looked new, their bodies showing none of the signs of malnutrition that marked German children. When a teacher distributed snacks, Ernst saw children discard half-eaten apples and uneaten portions of sandwiches, waste that would have caused riots in German schoolyards where children fought over crusts. Camp Concordia sat on the flat Kansas prairie like a small city dropped from the sky. Built in just 6 months, it covered over 600 acres and could house 4,000 prisoners in conditions that exceeded anything Ernst had experienced as a soldier. The barracks featured real beds with mattresses, not the wooden bunks or dirt floors he had known in North Africa. Electric lights illuminated every building. Hot water flowed from showers that worked on demand rather than according to ration schedules. Flush toilets in dedicated facilities replaced the disease-breeding latrines of military. But it was the dining hall that stopped Ernst in his tracks on that March afternoon. The building could seat 500 men at once, with long tables arranged in neat rows. Industrial kitchens visible through serving windows contained equipment that would have been considered extravagant in civilian restaurants back home. Steam tables kept food at proper temperatures. Ice machines provided cold drinks. The smell emanating from those kitchens spoke of actual cooking rather than the reheating of preserved rations. The first meal at Camp Concordia became a watershed moment that Ernst would remember with perfect clarity decades later. He entered the dining hall with 200 other new arrivals, all of them carrying the wary suspicion of men who had learned that hope was a luxury that led to disappointment. They collected trays and utensils, moving through a serving line where kitchen staff ladled portions that seemed designed to feed giants rather than men. Roasted chicken, actual chicken with crispy skin and meat that fell from the bone. Mashed potatoes enriched with butter and milk, their texture creamy rather than the gluey consistency of potato starch mixed with water. Green beans that still had color and texture rather than the gray mush of overboiled vegetables. Dinner rolls plural, more than one fresh from ovens and still warm. A slice of apple pie for dessert, the crust made with real butter, and the filling sweetened with sugar that must have come from some inexhaustible American reserve. Ernst found a seat at a table occupied by other Germans, all of them staring at their trays with expressions ranging from disbelief to suspicion. No one spoke. The only sound was the scrape of utensils against metal trays as they began to eat with the focused intensity of men who expected the food to vanish if they looked away. The chicken tasted like memory, like Sunday dinners before the war, like normal life in a world that no longer existed for them. Then something happened that would fundamentally alter Ernst's understanding of his captivity. An American guard, a sergeant named Miller with a broad Midwest face and easy smile, sat down at their table, not nearby, not supervising from a distance, but actually sat among them, his own tray loaded with the identical meal they had been serving. He nodded a greeting, then began to eat as casual as if he were dining with friends rather than enemy soldiers he was tasked with guarding. The Germans froze. This violated every protocol they understood about the relationship between captor and captive. Guards maintained distance, enforced hierarchy, reminded prisoners of their subordinate status through every interaction. They did not sit at the same tables, did not eat the same food, did not treat imprisonment as a social occasion requiring only minimal courtesy. Sergeant Miller seemed oblivious to their discomfort. He ate his chicken, complimented the kitchen staff to no one in particular, then attempted conversation in broken German he had apparently learned from a friend. "The weather is good," he offered, his pronunciation torture to Ernst's ears but his intent clear. "Kansas is nice in spring. You will like working here." Franz Weber, always the bold one, asked the question that hung over the table like smoke: "Why do you eat with us? Guards do not eat with prisoners." Miller looked confused for a moment, then shrugged with an ease that suggested the question itself puzzled him. "Why not?" he replied in English, then repeated it slowly in mangled German. "Same food, same dining hall. We are all people, yes?" The simplicity of the answer somehow made it more profound. Same food. In the German military, officers ate separately from enlisted men, with rations that reflected rank and privilege. The idea that guards and prisoners would receive identical meals, prepared in the same kitchens and served without distinction, challenged fundamental assumptions about military hierarchy and the spoils of victory. Over the following days, Ernst observed that the scene in the dining hall was not an aberration but standard practice. 3 times daily, prisoners and guards filed through the same serving lines, received the same portions, and sat wherever space permitted without regard to the nominal boundaries between free men and captives. American soldiers traded jokes with German prisoners. They discussed weather, work assignments, sports they had played before the war, anything that established common ground across the divide of conflict. The psychological impact proved more unsettling than any interrogation technique. Ernst had been prepared for brutality, for deprivation designed to break spirits and extract information. He had steeled himself against torture and abuse that propaganda had promised would be the lot of German prisoners in American hands. What he encountered instead was a systematic assault on his ideology through the simple act of inclusion, of being treated as a human being rather than a defeated enemy deserving only contempt. The quality of the food remained consistent, almost aggressively so. Breakfast brought eggs, real eggs fried or scrambled according to preference, accompanied by bacon or sausage, toast with butter and jam, hot cereal with milk and sugar, fresh fruit when available, and coffee in quantities that seemed unlimited. Lunch featured soups and sandwiches made with a variety of meats that rotated daily. Dinner offered roasted meats, vegetables prepared in different styles, starches ranging from potatoes to rice to pasta, and desserts that would have been celebration foods in Germany. Ernst began to understand that this abundance was not temporary, not a propaganda display for new arrivals, but simply the normal state of American feeding. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive rations equivalent to those of garrison troops, and the Americans interpreted this literally. Prisoners ate what American soldiers ate, in the same quantities and the same variety, because the regulations said so, and because the resources existed to make it possible. The contrast with German military rations became impossible to ignore. Ernst had spent 3 years in the Wehrmacht watching ration quality decline as the war consumed resources faster than the economy could replace them. Butter had disappeared first, replaced by margarine that tasted of chemicals. Real coffee had given way to ersatz brews made from roasted acorns and barley. Meat became increasingly rare, supplemented by preserved fish and canned goods of dubious origin. Bread quality had deteriorated until it consisted mainly of potato starch and sawdust, requiring increasingly strong jaws to chew. The letters he received from home confirmed that civilian rations had declined even further. His mother wrote of turnip soup eaten daily because potatoes had become scarce. His sister mentioned standing in line for 3 hours to receive a quarter-pound of only to find the shop sold out before she reached the counter. His father, wounded at Stalingrad and discharged, described hunting rats in the cellar because the family cat had disappeared into someone's cooking pot. Reading those letters while sitting in an American dining hall, his stomach full of roasted pork and green beans, created guilt that gnawed at Ernst more effectively than any hunger had. How could he write home about the abundance surrounding him? How could he tell his mother that he ate meat daily while she subsisted on turnips? The truth seemed cruel, almost obscene in its inequality. Some prisoners tried to maintain ideological purity in the face of abundance. Otto Braun, a fervent Nazi who had served in the SS before transfer to the Afrika Korps, organized resistance to what he called American corruption. He urged prisoners to refuse the food, to maintain hunger strikes that would demonstrate German superiority over material temptation. His efforts collapsed within days as the smell of cooking overcame ideology. Even Otto eventually joined the serving lines, though he insisted on sitting separately and eating in bitter silence. The dining hall became a classroom where lessons in democracy were taught without lectures or explicit instruction. Ernst watched American guards of different backgrounds interact with an ease that Nazi racial theory insisted was impossible. German Americans named Schmidt and Muller worked alongside men named O'Brien and Kowalski. Italian Americans served food prepared by cooks named Martinez. The casual diversity suggested a social system that functioned despite theoretical impossibility. One evening, Ernst sat across from a guard named Private Jackson, an African-American soldier from Mississippi, who supervised work details with quiet competence. Nazi propaganda had devoted considerable effort to American racial divisions, insisting that black Americans were oppressed near slaves whose resentment would cripple the American war effort. Yet here was Jackson eating the same meal as white officers, giving orders that were followed without question, treated with the respect due to his rank rather than hindered by his race. Ernst asked, carefully, about the apparent contradiction. Jackson smiled, a knowing expression that suggested he had heard variations of this question before. It is not perfect, he acknowledged through an interpreter. There is prejudice, there is struggle, but I wear this uniform, I serve my country, and I eat at this table. That is more than your propaganda admits is possible. The simple dignity of the response shamed Ernst in ways he struggled to articulate. He had accepted Nazi racial theories without deep examination, assuming that the party's elaborate scientific justifications must have basis in fact. Confronting a living refutation of those theories while sitting in a dining hall, sharing a meal that included white guards, black guards, Hispanic guards, and German prisoners, created cognitive dissonance that grew more uncomfortable with each passing day. The kitchen staff became objects of fascination for prisoners with culinary backgrounds. Hermann Schultz, who had worked as a sous chef in a Berlin hotel before conscription, spent hours watching the American cooks through the serving windows. He marveled at the equipment, the ingredients, the casual abundance that allowed experimentation and variety. One day, he approached the head cook, a master sergeant named Williams, and asked through an interpreter if he might observe more closely. Williams not only agreed, but invited Hermann into the kitchen, setting a precedent that would transform the dining experience at Camp Concordia. Within weeks, German prisoners with kitchen experience were working alongside American cooks, learning techniques and recipes while contributing their own knowledge to the meals. The arrangement was practical from the American perspective, as it freed up soldiers for other duties. But it also created something unexpected, a collaborative environment, where former enemies worked toward the common goal of feeding everyone well. Herman reported back to Ernst and others about what he learned in those kitchens. The scale of American food supply chains amazed him. Meat arrived in refrigerated trucks from processing plants in Kansas City and Omaha. Vegetables came from farms across the region, fresh during growing season and canned or frozen during winter months. Flour arrived in 100-pound sacks, stamped with mill locations from across the Midwest. The logistics required to feed one prison camp exceeded what had been available to entire German divisions in the field. The waste streams provided their own education. Herman watched as kitchen staff scraped uneaten food into large bins destined for local pig farms. Quality food, sometimes entire meals that prisoners had taken but couldn't finish, became animal feed without ceremony or concern. In Germany, such waste would have been criminal. Here it was simply part of a system so abundant that conservation seemed unnecessary. Ernst began working outside the camp in April, assigned to a wheat farm owned by a family named Anderson. The work was hard but familiar, plowing and planting under a Kansas sun that felt almost gentle compared to the North African desert. The Anderson family treated their German workers with practical courtesy, providing water during breaks, serving lunch that matched what they ate themselves, and paying the government standard wages for prison labor. Mrs. Anderson, a sturdy woman in her 50s with hands calloused from farm work, insisted that workers eat lunch at the family table. This meant that Ernst and 3 other prisoners sat in the Anderson kitchen 3 times a week, sharing meals with the family and their hired hands. The informality of these arrangements continued to unsettle Ernst's sense of proper boundaries between victors and vanquished. The lunch meals revealed domestic abundance that paralleled what Ernst had seen in the camp dining hall. Mrs. Anderson prepared sandwiches with multiple meats, thick slices of cheese, fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden, and homemade bread that put even the camp's offerings to shame. She served these with potato salad made from real mayonnaise, pickles she had canned herself, and cookies that emerged from her oven with regularity that suggested sugar rationing was either non-existent or completely ignored. The Anderson children, 2 boys aged 8 and 12, fascinated Ernst with their casual relationship to abundance. They would take bites of sandwiches, then leave the remainder on their plates, declaring themselves full. They consumed milk by the glassful, often leaving some unfinished. They received cookies as after-school snacks, eating 1 or 2 and saving the rest for later. Their relationship to food spoke of lives lived without scarcity, without the calculations that Ernst had grown up with in Depression-era Germany and wartime rationing. One afternoon, Ernst watched the younger Anderson boy throw away a half-eaten apple because it had a small bruise. The gesture seemed almost criminal to someone who had seen men fight over fruit cores. When Mrs. Anderson noticed Ernst's expression, she smiled sadly. "You have seen hard times," she said through her halting German. "We are fortunate here. The war has not touched us like it has touched you." The acknowledgement of their different circumstances carried unexpected grace. Mrs. Anderson wasn't gloating over American abundance or German suffering. She was simply recognizing reality with the straightforward honesty that seemed characteristic of Kansas farmers. "The war was terrible for you," she continued, "but you are safe here. You will eat well, work hard, and when this is over you will go home to rebuild." Her confidence in eventual peace and German recovery spoke to certainties that Ernst could not share. Germany was losing the war. Anyone with eyes could see that. The question was what would remain when the fighting stopped, what kind of country he would return to after years of destruction and defeat. The thought of rebuilding seemed overwhelming when he could not imagine the rubble it would require clearing. Back at the camp, the dining hall continued its subtle education. Ernst noticed details he had missed initially, the way guards would save seats for prisoners they had worked with on details, the trading of food items between men, a guard giving his dessert to a prisoner who loved sweets in exchange for the prisoner's coffee, the casual conversations about home, about families waiting on both sides of the conflict, about hopes for after the war. These interactions accumulated into a portrait of American society that contradicted everything Ernst had been taught. The guards were not brutal enforcers but ordinary men drafted into service, most of them as reluctant to be soldiers as the prisoners had been. They talked about lives interrupted by war, about jobs they wanted to return to, about girls they hoped to marry when they got home. Their concerns were universal, human, indistinguishable from the concerns that occupied German prisoners. The mail arrived twice weekly, and Ernst would read his letters from home in the dining hall over coffee that remained hot in cups he could refill at will. The contrast between his mother's descriptions of queuing for rations and his current reality created a surreal disconnect. She wrote of making soup from potato peels and feeling fortunate to have them. He sat surrounded by food so plentiful that men left portions uneaten. The gap between these experiences seemed to exist in different universes rather than different countries fighting the same war. In May, the camp commander instituted a new policy that would deepen the integration between guards and prisoners. Dining hall seating would be randomized through a ticket system that assigned tables without regard to nationality or status. The stated purpose was to encourage English language learning among prisoners through regular interaction with native speakers. The practical effect was to force daily contact that made it increasingly difficult to maintain the psychological distance required for enmity. Ernst found himself assigned to tables with different guards each week. He learned their names, their home states, their plans for after the war. Private Thompson from Oregon talked endlessly about salmon fishing in rivers Ernst could not imagine. Corporal Martinez from New Mexico described desert landscapes that sounded beautiful rather than hostile. Sergeant O'Malley from Boston spoke with an accent so thick that Ernst could barely understand his English, but his gestures and laughter transcended language barriers. These men were not monsters. They were not the cruel oppressors that propaganda had promised. They were farmers and factory workers, students and store clerks, wearing uniforms they would gladly discard when given the chance. Their ordinariness made them somehow more remarkable than heroes would have been, because it suggested that decency was not exceptional but normal in a society that valued it. The food quality improved as summer arrived and local farms began producing fresh vegetables. The kitchen staff incorporated tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers and corn into meals that celebrated seasonal abundance. Salads appeared daily, dressed with oils and vinegars that had been impossible luxuries in Germany. Fresh fruit became regular dessert options, melons and berries served in quantities that seemed almost aggressive in their plenty. Ernst gained weight steadily, his body filling out to dimensions he had not known since before conscription. His uniforms required alteration. His face in the mirror showed cheeks rather than hollows, health rather than the gaunt desperation that had marked his final months in Africa. The transformation was visible in all the prisoners, men becoming recognizable again as they shed the skeletal appearance of starvation. The medical officer at Camp Concordia, Captain Davis, documented the physical recovery with clinical fascination. Within 4 months, average prisoner weight had increased by 28 pounds. Nutritional deficiencies that had plagued the men since their desert campaigns vanished entirely. Scurvy lesions healed, night vision returned, and the chronic fatigue that marked prolonged malnutrition lifted like fog under morning sun. The transformation was so complete that some prisoners became unrecognizable to themselves, their mirror reflections showing strangers who looked healthy and whole. But the psychological changes proved even more dramatic. Ernst watched as hardened Nazis who had arrived spouting party doctrine gradually fell silent in the face of daily contradictions. Otto Braun, who had organized that failed hunger strike, eventually requested assignment to the kitchen staff, where he worked alongside American cooks with surprising dedication. The ideological certainty that had sustained these men through years of warfare crumbled under the weight of shared meals and casual kindness. The 4th of July celebration in 1944 brought the transformation into sharp focus. The camp commander authorized a special dinner that pushed abundance into territory that seemed almost theatrical. Steaks grilled to individual preference, corn on the cob dripping with butter, watermelon served in massive slices, ice cream churned fresh that afternoon in flavors ranging from vanilla to strawberry. American flags decorated the dining hall, and a local band played patriotic music that celebrated victory over the very men who sat eating American plenty. The irony was not lost on Ernst. Here he sat, an enemy soldier, consuming food provided by the nation he had tried to destroy, surrounded by symbols of American triumph, while his own country burned under Allied bombs. The guards who served that meal showed no hint of cruelty or mockery. They wished the prisoners a happy holiday with apparent sincerity, as if the strange circumstances of their gathering required only basic courtesy rather than elaborate explanation. Sergeant Miller, who had first sat at Ernst's table months earlier, approached with a plate piled high with steak and corn. He gestured to the empty seat across from Ernst, who nodded permission from habit. Miller sat, cut into his steak, and spoke in his improving but still imperfect German. "My brother is fighting in France right now," he said quietly. "I think about him every day. I hope that if he is captured, someone feeds him like we feed you." The simple statement carried profound implications. Miller was not feeding prisoners out of regulatory obligation or propaganda purposes. He was treating enemies as he hoped his own brother would be treated, extending humanity in the hope that it might be reciprocated somewhere across the ocean. The golden rule applied even in warfare, suggesting a civilization confident enough in its values to practice them universally. Ernst found his voice after a long pause. "I hope your brother comes home safely," he replied in halting English. Miller smiled, raised his glass of lemonade in a small toast, and the two men ate in companionable silence that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. The autumn harvest brought prisoners into closer contact with Kansas farming communities. Ernst's work detail at the Anderson farm expanded to include neighbors who needed help bringing in wheat and corn. These families competed to provide the best meals for their workers, farm wives arriving at fields with baskets containing fried chicken, potato salad, fresh bread, and pies that rivaled anything produced in the camp kitchen. The casual competition to feed people well revealed priorities that Ernst struggled to reconcile with his understanding of warfare and scarcity. One farm wife, Mrs. Henderson, explained her philosophy while serving lunch to exhausted workers. "A hungry man cannot work well," she said simply, "and a well-fed man remembers kindness. When you go home to Germany, you will remember that Americans treated you fairly. That matters more than you might think now." Her words proved prophetic. As the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, prisoners at Camp Concordia began preparing for return to a devastated homeland. The Red Cross offered repatriation classes teaching skills for rebuilding destroyed cities. American authorities provided medical examinations ensuring prisoners returned healthy rather than broken. The dining hall continued serving generous meals even as victory approached, maintaining standards that suggested abundance was permanent rather than strategic. Ernst received word in April 1945 that his mother had survived the bombing of Dresden, though their family home was gone. The news should have brought relief, but instead triggered complex emotions. He had survived and even thrived while his mother lived through firestorms. He had gained weight while she lost it. He had eaten better as a prisoner than she had as a civilian in her own country. The guilt became almost unbearable during meals where guards asked about his family with genuine concern. Private Thompson, the fisherman from Oregon, offered perspective that helped Ernst process the contradiction. "War is crazy that way," he said. "Nothing about it makes sense. You eat well here because that is how we do things. Your mother suffered because war is terrible. Neither fact cancels the other. You survived, that is what matters. When you go home you can help her rebuild." The simplicity of American pragmatism cut through Ernst's spiral of guilt. He could not change what had happened. He could only move forward, carrying with him the lessons learned through the unlikely education of shared meals in a Kansas prison camp. The final dinner at Camp Concordia came in June 1946, a farewell meal for prisoners scheduled for repatriation. The kitchen staff outdid themselves with a spread that would have seemed impossible even by the camp's generous standards. Roasted turkey, glazed ham, every side dish that had become familiar over 2 years of captivity, and desserts that included both American pies and German pastries that kitchen staff had learned to make from prisoner recipes. Guards and prisoners sat together one last time, the dining hall filled with conversations mixing English and German, laughter and nostalgia for experiences that should have been unmemorable but had instead become transformative. Sergeant Miller found Ernst and shook his hand with warmth that went beyond military protocol. "You were never our enemy," he said. "Just a soldier doing his duty like we do ours. Go home and build something good." Ernst carried a plate to his familiar table and sat for the last time in a chair that had become as comfortable as any he had known. He looked around the dining hall at guards and prisoners sharing final meals, at the abundance that had seemed so impossible upon arrival, at the casual integration that had challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare and human nature. When he boarded the ship for Germany weeks later, Ernst carried more than just restored health. He brought with him an understanding that true strength came not from conquest but from confidence so deep it could afford generosity toward enemies. The dining hall at Camp Concordia had taught him that democracy was not weakness but power expressed through inclusion rather than domination. Those lessons would guide him through decades of rebuilding, whispering to him during difficult moments that a better world was possible because he had tasted it across tables where enemies became simply men sharing meals. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.